My guest is Robert Rand, who's a leading acoustician from the US. And Rob, it's really great to have you on the show.
Thanks, John. It's great to be here.
Now, you've been in acoustics for a long time and are a real specialist in it. And there are very few acousticians who are both specialists and can communicate, I think, to ordinary people in language they understand. How did you get into acoustics in the first place?
Uh, During my undergraduate degree at the University of Maine, I needed to pick up some credits, and I had been studying acoustics on my own in the 70s and saw a course taught by Professor Waldo Libby in noise and vibration control theory. So over the summer, I met him. I went to meet him, and I said, I'm interested in your course, and he said, well, you'll fail. And this is a fourth year electrical engineering elective course, so you have to at least know a little bit about
encouraging words, Rob. Yes,
encouraging words. Well, he egged me on in a way because I wasn't going to take no for an answer. So I said, well, give me a couple of books to read over the summer and I'll have a go at it. He said, okay. Well, I ended up getting good grades fall and spring semesters. And he said, he took me aside and said, of all the people that took this course this year, I actually can see you going on to work in acoustics. You have the temperament for it. I interviewed at Stone and Webster Engineering in Boston, and they heard about my background doing live sound engineering for the Paul Winter Consort and said, well, we'd like to hire you. And after they also found out that I studied with Professor Waldo Libby, because they had two other people in their group who had studied with him. And so I started after that, and they put me right to work. And I was very fortunate to work with a couple of engineers who were excellent mentors. Frank de Blasi was my primary mentor, and he always said, tell me the story. Tell me what you heard. And now let's look at the data and see how that data tells that story. And that was my primary training in terms of communicating about the noise. And I managed very large budgets for noise control at Stone and Webster, very large, 6-7 figures. And I would have to explain why the client was going to have to spend those amounts of money for noise control. And because of the training that I received with Frank and a couple other people on staff there, I was able to do that. And we had very good successes with noise control of very large power plants and commercial facilities. So I worked there for 10 years. I went out and worked at a couple other companies. I hung up my shingle in 1996. And so I started working at Stone and Webster in 1980. And then 96, I hung up my shingle and just kept working as a consultant since then. And there's been ups and downs. So most people don't really think about noise. They don't think about the soundscape around them. They are always thinking about it in a way, but it tends to be down in the subconscious. They're not really thinking about, well, is this what I want my environment to be like? So I think part of the communication process is getting people to think a little bit more about their soundscape and how do they want their environment to be around them.
No, I think that's interesting. I think you're absolutely right that people, unless they're really disturbed by a particular noise, don't really think about noise as such. It's part of life. It's part of the background of life, in the way that perhaps people these days certainly think about air pollution, but they really don't think in noise terms unless they're disturbed.
Yeah, I agree. There's an old saying that noise is like politics. Noise is local. So if there's a noise source 20 miles away, odds are it's not going to bother your home. But if it's next door, it can be a problem. So part of our work at Stone and Webster was to help our clients be good acoustic neighbors, and we would approach them that way and said, there are benefits for you when you work this way. That the investment you make in the noise control prevents lawsuits and loss of goodwill, which is a corporate consideration. And most business people understand that. At least they did back in the 80s and 90s. I don't know how much they understand right now, these days. But protecting your goodwill as a corporation is a business factor. And so that comes into play. I don't see that being exercised in the renewable industry. I don't see a concern for goodwill.
Now that's interesting, because I wanted to come on to the renewables and wind farms in particular, because you became really interested in wind farms after you yourself experienced noise from wind turbines.
It actually happened just about a couple of years before that. In the spring of 2009, I was at the breakfast table reading the paper, and there was on the front page, there was a news report about a lawsuit about noise at Mars Hill, which is a location here in Maine, up in northern Maine, where a line of turbines had been installed along the ridge line at Mars Hill, and it was driving people out of their homes, the noise from the turbines. And I mean, my first reaction to the article before reading the details was, why is there a lawsuit about noise? Where's the noise control? Well, that's really formed everything, because when I started looking into it, I realized there isn't any noise control for wind turbines. The only thing they have is sufficient distance based on the size of the turbine during the permitting stage. You've got to have sufficient distance, and because once they're installed, there they are. They don't move them, and they don't shut them down. The state ended up giving Mars Hill a 7 decibel allowance. They had there's a paragraph in the Maine state law, which was formulated in 1989, and this paragraph is essentially a get out of jail free card, so to speak, for developers that can't meet the ordinance. So they can plead their case and say, we've done everything we can do, and then the state gives them an allowance. And that's what they did at Mars Hill.
Certainly in the UK, it is similar, that there's a feeling that actually the regulations on noise turbines are pretty lax. But I wanted to raise this point with you. When we raised the question of noise from wind turbines, and we've raised it with many authorities, including government ministers, they say, noise from wind turbines? Wind turbines are noisy, but
right.
They can't be. Why don't you just continue complaining about traffic noise and aircraft noise? Wind turbines, they're not really. Now that's an obstacle we've got to get across.
Well, this is an interesting point. Most people that I've met here in the US think wind turbines are silent.
Yeah.
The marketing has been very effective. When you put a photograph of wind turbines in a newspaper, you can't hear them. You just see a picture of them. They're not rotating. You don't feel the barometric pulsations from them. You don't hear the whooshes and whumps when you're out 2,000 to 5,000 feet away from them. You don't hear the swishes and the clunks and all the strange noises that they make when they encounter abrupt changes in wind speed up in the blade envelope, which occurs mostly at night. Wind turbines are installed far and away, by far. There are rare exceptions, but by far they're installed in wilderness and rural areas where it's very quiet. Most people don't understand that human perception or annoyance to noise is related to the change, the increase of the intrusive noise over the background. This was one of the problems with Schultz's annoyance curve that came out in the late 70s. And I had very spirited conversations with my colleagues and my supervisor about Schultz's curve, because the curve, in order for that curve to work, it has to abandon the background level. The background level is clearly elucidated in the US EPA's findings, and you've probably seen my graphs showing the EPA community response to noise, which can be adjusted depending on the community, which includes you can adjust to a quiet rural background. And so there's that combination where politicians generally are living in urban residential or built up urban areas. They don't live out in the country necessarily. I would guess some do. But if they do, they're not living near noisy highways. They're not living near rail. They're not living near wind turbines. They have a idyllic life. I'm not saying that's true for all, but that may be true for many.
And people
Then we have
don't.
this.
Sorry, do go
We
on.
have this third. So people think wind turbines are silent. The people who are regulating don't live near them, so they don't experience the impacts. The third thing is we have the distribution of sensitivity to noise in the population. And although it's, I can't really prove this, perhaps it's anecdotal because it's just my experience, but I find that politicians far and away are in that third of the population, or maybe even the top 10% of the population that has no sensitivity to noise at all. They have no concept of noise pollution, and it does not concern them. So there, and then you, on the end of the spectrum, where in the country where people's ears get attuned to quiet, and then you bring in an intrusive industrial noise that's running all day and all night, and is in fact louder at night due to all the factors you know about, John, the shear boundary layering. The blades are swinging up through fast air and back down into slow. Sometimes they're swinging through abrupt changes in wind speed. They swing through the layer. So all of those three factors combine to make it very difficult to get awareness going on the political level. There's the fourth, which is perhaps the most insidious, which is that, generally speaking, large systems are corrupt. It's just the way they end up. They end up being corrupted, and politics is a large system. The residents who live out in the country are generally not of significant means.
Yeah.
They don't have the political power. As an example, here in the U.S., at this point, I would say, with the possible exception of Oregon, states don't enforce their noise regulations. Maine turned over regulation of noise to the towns back in 1993, or thereabouts. So we have a kind of a perfect storm of unfortunate circumstances. We have politicians who are insensitive to noise. We have politicians who are corrupt. We have states that are not enforcing their regulations. We have people who are being impacted who don't have political power or influence. We have a source that only has one effective noise control, and that's distance, which is eliminated once they're installed. Once they're installed and they're generating complaints, the only noise control option is shutdown, the only reliable one.
Indeed, and you're quite right. It's the same in the UK. So many of the people living in the rural areas are low income. They don't have clout. They don't have a political voice, and therefore they're ridden over pretty roughshod, despite the fact that, story after story, anecdote after anecdote, video after video shows that they are suffering badly from noise. But I also wonder whether, and they're neglected by politicians, they're neglected by the authorities. Do you think they're also neglected by the environmental movement as a whole?
Well, it would seem so. As an example, here in the U.S., we have large organizations which are involved with environmental protection, and I'm noticing they give wind and solar a pass, and it's not clear why. Uh, Now, it could be said that noise is a somewhat complex subject, and people have to warm up to it. They have to become informed about it. It's not quite the same as air pollution, which seems easier for people to grasp. Uh, but noise isn't that hard to grasp. And as you say, sometimes when people talk about wind turbine noise, people say, well, what about transportation? So they clearly have a grasp of what noise pollution looks like, perhaps to the ordinary person, the cars and trucks whizzing by at 5 in the morning when they're still trying to get another hour of sleep. So it can't be that they're misinformed. It looks to be deliberate.
And
They're very intelligent people, very
yeah,
smart. It doesn't take long to get educated if they wanted. They could contact people like me, anybody in the Institute of Noise Control Engineers. We're not hard to find. That doesn't happen generally.
and why do you think it is deliberate on behalf of many within the environmental movement?
Well, there's only a couple of options. One is that it's ideology, that they have a belief that wind and solar will solve a vexing problem for them, that they hold something to be a vexing problem, such as global warming. Now, it's been 13 years since I started investigating wind turbine noise, and I have yet to see an engineering study quantifying the effect of wind turbine operations on global warming. I don't think there's been one developed, which means that politicians and non-governmental organizations are operating blind. They don't have a basis for, if they have a belief that wind turbines are going to save the planet, so to speak. There's no engineering study showing the effect of a wind turbine operation. There are engineering studies show that that land is heated in the vicinity of wind turbine facilities, that the perturbations of the air by the blades keep the warm air down at the ground, and the ground gets warmed up. I have clients in Colorado whose fields have dried up. They live nearby large wind facility, and their fields went dry. The ground cracked. So I'm just seeing it. If it's ideology, then it's flying blind, even with evidence that there may be negative effects locally. The only other thing I can come up with is that they are captured by political and financial considerations.
Because it is the same green groups who will criticize growth of aviation or are very critical of fracking. And I'm not making any comments on the worth of aviation or fracking, but just they go silent on it seems to me, on the downsides of wind turbines.
That may be. I don't follow all of those organizations that much. I run into them in the course of my work, but I'm noticing an unusual lack of empathy for the environment. Maine, the nickname, so to speak, for the state of Maine is vacation land.
Right.
Part of being on vacation is that you go away from the noise and bustle of urban life, of the urban areas. You go out of Boston, out of New York, and you go up into the wilderness of Maine to fish and hunt and camp and hike in the beautiful, quiet areas, wilderness areas of Maine. Well, Maine is busy paving over its wilderness areas. There's a new facility going in up in northern Maine. I think it's 179 turbines. I'm not sure how large they are these days. I think they start at 4.5 megawatts and go up now. I'm just looking at another application where I think there's 6 megawatts on land. On land. I mean, these are large turbines, and they're getting bigger. And the noise footprint from turbines like this is enormous. Just the spacing for power, the industry rule of thumb is 60 acres per megawatt. That's so that when the turbulence comes off a blade, one turbine and goes down into the facility, they have enough room. But I think that's not enough. These big ones, some of the studies I've read, engineering studies on turbines, they need roughly at least 6 times the height. 10 times is better to prevent power losses in the facilities. And these get getting so big, I'm not sure that they're going to have room for them as they get bigger and bigger.
Well, that's
again, I'm going a little afield from your question.
No, don't worry. It's interesting. The other thing, of course, that I think people don't really understand too often is the type of noise emitted by turbines. That there is so much low frequency within the noise, and that can be particularly disturbing. Do you want to say a little bit about that?
Typically, when organizations or promoters do a tour for wind turbines, they'll take people in a 10-person van or something. They'll take them up under the base of a turbine, and they'll get out. Now, in the car, they've all been talking. The noise levels are up at 65, 70, 75, and they're laughing and talking. It's pretty loud. They get out of the van, and it's 55 under the turbine, and it's pretty steady. It's going up and down maybe a dB or 2 at the most. It's mostly high frequencies. I mean, the low frequencies are there, but what you hear in terms of the spectrum is mid and high frequencies, so that kind of thing. And because it's quieter than in the car, everyone goes, these aren't bad. These are pretty quiet. Yes. There's 10, 15 dB quieter than in the car they were in a few moments ago. So they'd stand there for a few minutes, and they walk around a little bit, and they talk a little bit, and then they get back in the van, they go away. So what's their impression of the turbines? Well, they're quiet. They make this sort of high frequency swishing sound. They don't go try to stay overnight in a house that's half a mile away, 2/3 of a mile away at night. When at that distance, all the high frequencies are gone. They've been chewed up by the air through the natural acoustics of air. And what's left is the low frequencies. And the low frequencies are constantly changing because the blades are spinning around and they're going through different wind speeds. And the air coming through the blade envelope is turbulent. And the blades are swinging through high speeds and then low speeds. And so sometimes there's a boundary layer in there. So they suddenly change. You get a thwack. I've actually heard thwacks. Like if someone was rowing a skiff on the river and they caught the blade, and you get this sudden thwacking sound and sensation. And whumps, whooshes and whumps occur as at night. primarily. You can get those in the day as well, but at night they can be much louder at night. Again, because of the boundary layering, and that's when people are trying to sleep. Recently, I measured 2 years in a row at Antrim, New Hampshire. The developer's consultant, sound consultant, predicted the noise level would not exceed, I think it was 36 dBA. I measured 53 at 2/3 of a mile, 30 almost 3,700 feet. And these are unruly. They fluctuate. The noise is always changing. If the noise is always the same, the ear might be able to get used to it, but it's always changing. And the pulses are coming in, the frequencies are coming in the range that the human ear uses for speech decoding, which is roughly a half a hertz to 16 hertz. That's what's called the speech modulation index. That's the range of modulations of speech. So we have very highly developed neural pathways to decode speech because it's important. Speech carries important information. Get out of the house. Fire.
Yeah.
We need to be able to decode information very quickly and act very quickly, and our brains have been trained through growing up and learning language and learning how to detect things, and then encountering situations where we need to decode speech and use it, and it happens automatically. So it happens around the clock. This has been shown in research. It happens during our sleep, never stops. So we're trying to sleep, and in comes this sound of whoomp, whoomp. Now, our frontal cortex might say, oh, that's the turbine. Meanwhile, in the back, the audio pathways are busy trying to figure out what it means. They're burning sugars, brain sugars, the most expensive sugars on the planet. They're burning brain sugars to try to figure out what that sound means. And now it has no meaning, but it's trying to decode it. And that's the hypothesis I came up with 12 years ago, and I've been presenting that to people. But I think this is a very important point. When you have low frequency information modulating in the range of modulations used in speech, you're guaranteed to capture the body's attention and burn brain sugars to decode it. And that when there is no useful result, that must produce some degree of physiological annoyance.
No, that's absolutely fascinating, and I'm sure it's why people say it. I just can't. I don't just hear the noise. I feel the noise.
Well, they do feel the noise, partly because there are barometric oscillations, pulsations that are coming off the turbines. These sources are so large. The blades are like really long, skinny subwoofers. And when they get, see if I can show it here. So let's say, they're being bent back by the higher winds at the top, and then when they come down, they dump their load. So they're flapping like this. Just like a woofer would go like this, but they're just flapping like this. So they are displacing the air barometrically. And I've measured those barometric oscillations as far as 32 miles. And I'm not the only ones. The federal organizations here measure them in the Southwest at similar distances. And those barometric pulsations come along and they'll hit the roof of the house, and the roof will deflect like this. So if you're inside a drum and you hit the skin of the drum, is the pressure going to be higher outside or inside? It's going to be higher inside. And that's what we measured in Falmouth when we got clobbered in 2011, 2 years after I started looking at this. That we measured that the pulsations inside that house, which is a home built for their retired years, nice house, the pressure was higher inside when the pulses came along.
Which of course is where people sleep, it's where people live, and it's why people often say it's at night when I'm asleep in my own house that it becomes unbearable.
That's right.
Rob, can we turn to other sources of noise? Because you've done really fascinating charts about sources of energy noise, sources of energy and the noise that they make. And, wind turbines, as we've discussed, the noise is very high, it's very disturbing. Nuclear is at the other end of the scale, isn't it?
Nuclear is dense, and you might be referring to a chart that I put up on Twitter, and I posted it a few times.
Yep.
I have different people that I'm interacting with, and it's the chart is data that I assembled from surveys performed at Stone & Webster on nuclear, coal, and oil and gas plants. So, and then 3 surveys that I could put more data on this because I've done a number of surveys since I made this chart. The 3 surveys of wind turbines here in Maine.
Did you include solar, or was this before solar really?
This was before
solar
before
became
solar.
more extensive. Yeah.
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 So this is the graph you might be thinking of.
Yeah.
This is a set of data from acquired during hundreds of hours of surveys at Stone & Webster, and also 3 wind turbines, Freedom, Mars Hill, and Kibbe. The Freedom was 2 GE 1.5 SLEs, so the nameplate total was 3 megawatts, and I measured in the clear in 2010, a mile from these turbines. It was in January, so it was quiet. And the turbines were dominating the acoustic environment at a mile, dominating it. What I've done with these data is I've calculated the distance needed to achieve a sound level of 33 dBA average. And the 33 dBA average is based on the use of the EPA normalized community response for quiet rural areas where you have an intrusive noise, and the noise has specific characteristics which are annoying. And then I've adjusted all the data to this metric, if you will, which is what is the distance needed from this facility to have a level of 33 dBA at night.
And just to say, for people who may not be so familiar with 33 dBA, that is a level recognized as pretty quiet.
It's pretty quiet. It's background sound levels in rural areas are down in the 12 to 20 dBA range. Most meters don't go down below 16. That's the noise floor of the meter, the type 1 meters. But background, very quiet background at night can get very quiet. And 33 is the level associated to that Steve Ambrose and I worked out to achieve no more than sporadic complaints. So noise control is a bit of an art because there are always people who complain about anything, but they're a very tiny part of the population. you can design so that there are no specific complaints from industrial facilities using a variety of noise controls. As I've said before, the wind only has one reliable noise control option, which is distance. But these other sources, nuclear, coal, oil, and gas, all have multiple noise controls, including distance. They have silencers for intakes and exhausts. You can wrap lagging on piping and valves. You can enclose entire equipment systems in buildings. You can insulate the buildings. You can insulate the ceilings. You can insulate HVAC, provide silencing on HVAC. So there are many, many methods. Transformers can be enclosed completely. They can be surrounded by a noise control block, which is slotted to match the frequencies coming out of the transformers. In England, that would be 50, 100 hertz, 200 hertz, 400 hertz, that kind of thing. In the US, 120, 240, 360, 480, the primary transformer tones. But all of those have noise controls. Wind turbines only have distance. And then wind turbines require a lot of space, a lot of land use because of the interference that they create with each other from wake effects. And because they are elevated, the noise travels long distance with nothing in between. You can't use a barrier with a wind turbine because wind turbines are hundreds of feet in the air. You can't build a barrier high enough to provide a noise control for that. So this chart represents a direct comparison of several different power technologies, power generation technologies. The gray, there are a couple of bunches of gray dots in the fossil, the coal. Those are gas plants. So if you're looking at it, say 1,000, 2, 3, 4, 5. So between 5,000 and 6,000 feet, roughly a mile at about 100 megawatts. Those are gas, simple cycle gas plants, 100 megawatt gas plants. There are some that are combined cycle, a little bit larger. They're a little bit farther away out at about 8,000 feet. Larger plants, larger power outputs. And they need a little bit more distance. But again, look at the power output. We're talking 100 megawatts for gas versus 3 for wind turbines. And then you go up to nuclear, and you've got a whole different ballgame. We're talking about the 2 orders of magnitude more power, and in many cases, less distance required to meet this distance where we would not expect complaints in a quiet rural area. It's just so much more efficient because they are so dense. The primary noise emissions from nuclear are the cooling towers. And the cooling towers have noise controls available to them for the motors and pumps, and those can provide tonal noise outputs, and they can be noise controlled. The falling water sound is actually not that unpleasant. It just sounds like you're near a large falls, like a river falls.
This is quite fascinating, Rob. I know you haven't done fracking on this, but what would you say about fracking? I mean, it clearly can cause a noise, but are there what sort of controls are possible for fracking?
I haven't worked on fracking facilities. I have seen a number of them. I have worked for many years out in the Midwest in Colorado, and there's active fracking operations in Colorado. Typically, what's done is a very high barrier is put around the entire fracking operation.
And although you haven't done work on it, would your sense be that that would uh, deaden the noise so that it would not affect local communities, or is it difficult to say?
It's a little tricky because barriers work best when the sources and the receivers are close to the barrier. When the receivers are further out, the barrier becomes a little less effective. At the same time, you have the benefit of that distance, so it's kind of a trade-off. It also depends on the sources. The fracking operations have repetitive sounds, they have impulsive sounds, pump sounds, tonal sounds. There's a bunch of different sounds going on. I am aware of complaints from fracking operations noise, and one of the difficulties I've seen is that the noise control regulation is somewhat lax. I have heard of protracted complaining, which suggests that the noise complaints are not being addressed. And there would be no technical reason to avoid eliminating noise complaints from any ground-based operations.
That's really interesting, because as you probably know, there's discussions in the UK as to whether fracking should go ahead or should not go ahead. At the moment, the answer from the government is no. But some of the concerns from local communities have been that they will be subject to a lot of noise. And I think what you're saying is that there's no real reason, if the right regulations and equipment is in place, that there should be noise from the fracking operation itself.
One of the most effective noise control methods is administration, time management.
Yeah.
So you have noisy operations during the day, such as construction. It's limited to daytime hours, and then people can sleep. So there are many ways to handle noise control. It requires political will and spine, because noise control costs money, and that money spent contributes to the goodwill of the company. So it's to not spend it it looks short-sighted, at least. And my experience with companies that have done noise control to be good neighbors is that it always pays off, always. They're always remembered for that.
I think that's absolutely right. Well, listen, I think we're coming to the close to the end of our conversation. But Rob, I just wonder, noise, we started off by saying noise is really often not considered. We've called it in the UK Noise Association the Cinderella pollutant. Cinderella.
I hadn't heard that. Yeah.
Yes. Will she ever get to the? Will noise ever? Will she ever get to the ball? Will noise ever be considered as a serious pollutant? What's your thoughts? It's kind of a final question. Are you overall optimistic, or do you feel that things will carry on much as they are right now for some time?
I think things tend to operate in cycles. We had a lot of attention on noise in the 70s. Then in the 80s, Congress shut down the Office of Noise Abatement here. At the same time, there's starting to be a lot of work in Europe with the WHO and comprehensive noise mapping. I think, and I think Europe is far ahead of the US at this point on the understanding of noise impacts on people and on health and on life years lost. I think the US is in a bit of a wild, wild west with many other countries in the world, but I think it tends to run in cycles. So at this time, I'm noticing, at least in the US, there's no real noise regulation by the states. There may be some locally for nuisance, but most of the time when there's a noise issue, it often goes unresolved. Wind turbines are, I would go so far as to say, they're absolutely unregulated. That has a corrosive effect on regulation because of equal treatment. If someone raises a noise complaint against, let's say, a gas plant, well, the owners of the gas plant can say, well, you had complaints of these wind turbines and you didn't do anything with them. It may, where it was important 30 years ago, maybe, or longer. Gee, I guess that's 50 years ago now. But it may come back. Some of these things may resolve. The push for example, in Maine, a lot of people are installing heat pumps because they're so much more efficient for heating and they can provide cooling simultaneously. Heat pumps run on electricity. They need reliable electricity. And every study that I've seen says wind and solar are not reliable. For example, there's no solar at night and there's no wind when the wind doesn't blow. And but heat pumps need power on demand. That's how our grid runs. Nuclear is dispatchable and highly reliable. I don't know if you've heard of the term N+1. Have you ever heard of that term?
I do know of it, yes. Yeah.
Yeah. N+1 is an engineering concept where you always have one more device than you need. For example, if you need to move water with pumps, you would and you need a certain number of pumps, you would have one more. And so at any time you can be repairing a pump and have the capacity that you need. I can easily envision looking out 10, 20 years where people are perhaps starting to build modular nuclear facilities in an N+1 format. For example, 400 megawatt SMRs, where the local demand is, say, 300 most of the time, and maybe peaks in the summer up to 360. And so they can run with one unit essentially idle most of the time, but then when they have to service, say, unit 2, they can fire up unit 4 to full power and service unit 2 and have 1, 3, and 4 running at their 300 megawatt demand. I can easily see that looking out a few decades. So I think right now there's just such a lack of knowledge about engineering and power design. And it's really not necessarily the politicians' fault because they didn't study engineering. There are a few, but not very many. And so, they know what they know, but they don't know power. And it's obvious. It's obvious by the way it's being handled. So I think going forward, I think we may see a swing, not so much through a deliberate embracing of noise control, but through systemic change where the quieter power will start to take more of a role. And the noisiest power, which as it happens is also the least reliable, may become idle over time. I mean, California desert is full of thousands of wind turbines just standing there dead. They weren't maintained, they weren't replaced, they weren't uprated, they weren't retooled or repurposed. They were just abandoned. And it wouldn't surprise me looking out, if I were 80, 90 years out, looking back to see all of these wind turbines are being installed now, standing there idle, and more than a few organizations that developed to deal with the groundwater pollution from the synthetic oils leakage and so on. But the 80, 90 years out wouldn't surprise me at all if the world was running on a lot more nuclear than it is now.
Rob, thanks so much for that, and thank you for talking to me. It's been absolutely fascinating, and to hear about acoustics, about noise, about something that is actually going to be so relevant to all of us, these new sources of energy over the next few decades, explained so clearly. So thanks very much, Rob.
John, thanks a lot. And I'll look forward to our next conversation whenever that happens. It's been a pleasure talking with you. Thanks so much for the call.